It was the kind of knock you don't forget, not because it was loud or strange, but because it came at a time of night when no one should be knocking at all. 3 firm raps on the front door. Deliberate. Steady. I remember how the house seemed to hold its breath afterward. No footsteps walking away. No sound of a car pulling off. Just silence, thick as the rain outside and the faint creak of the old maple branches tapping against the windows. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if stories like this ever touched your town or your family, click that like and subscribe. Every click helps bring a little more truth into the light. I'm Margaret Winslow. I was born and raised in Portland, Oregon. Been here my whole life. I was working full-time as a nurse back in 2006, long shifts at Providence, always on my feet. My husband David ran a small garage down on Stark. He was quiet, steady, the kind of man who'd rather fix your alternator than talk about the weather. And our son Jacob, well, Jacob was just good, kind-hearted, always scribbling in that sketchbook of his. We lived in an old Craftsman on Alder Street, just up from the corner store. The kind of place with loose floorboards and a front porch that creaked in the wind. Out front stood a tall maple tree Jacob used to climb after school, especially when the air turned crisp and the leaves went golden. I used to stand at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee and watch him up there, boots wedged between branches, face turned toward the sky like he was trying to memorize the clouds. We weren't perfect, but we were solid. Even when money was tight, we made do. David didn't talk much, but he showed his love in practical ways, tightening the screws on Jacob's bike, bringing me my favorite kind of tea when he filled up the gas. And Jacob, he noticed things. Not just big things either. The look on someone's face when they thought no one was watching. The way the wind moved through the trees a little differently right before it rained. Looking back, I think he felt something before any of us did. There was a morning that still stands out. Late October. Jacob had a dentist appointment, and I was rushing to get out the door. David handed him a little metal keychain, one of those cheap ones from a hardware store, oval-shaped initials etched into it. J.W. He said, "This way, you'll always know where home is." Jacob slipped it into his pocket without a word. I remember thinking it was sweet, but nothing more. Just a small moment between a father and his son. The days were starting to shorten then. I'd come home in the dark sometimes, not until Jacob was already in bed, but he always left little things for me, a note on the fridge, a page from his sketchbook folded next to the coffee pot. It was our way of staying close when time got away from us. That last week of October, the rain came in heavy. A steady drizzle that didn't let up, just soaked into everything, coats mail the cracks in the sidewalk. It made the whole city feel softer, quieter. That's when I noticed it, the sense that someone was watching the house. I chalked it up to fatigue. Long shifts, too much caffeine. But there were little things. A car that slowed down a bit too long out front. Footprints on the porch that didn't match our boots. One morning, the gate to the backyard was swinging open, though I knew I'd latched it the night before. And then came that Thursday. I was home early for once. Jacob was supposed to walk home from school like always, just a 15-minute stretch along Alder past the corner store. But the clock kept ticking. The wind picked up. The maple outside groaned in the cold, damp air. And Jacob never came through the door. The sky had turned that flat, heavy gray it always does before Portland rain settles in for the long haul. I remember standing in the hallway staring at the clock above the door. It was nearly 4:30 p.m. Jacob should have been home an hour earlier. The walk from school wasn't long, 12 minutes if he took the shortcut behind the corner market, but that afternoon the minutes dragged wider than they should have. I went out onto the porch looking down Alder Street. A few kids were still out, backpacks slung low, jackets pulled tight. But no Jacob. His friends peeled off one by one. I waited another 10 minutes, then went back inside and called the school. They transferred me to the main office. The secretary on the other end of the line sounded polite, maybe a little too polite. She asked if I was calling to excuse Jacob's early pickup. I said no, he hadn't been picked up. I asked if they'd seen him after last bell. She hesitated, said she'd check with his last period teacher. I remember setting the phone down, walking back to the kitchen, and just standing there staring at the bowl of apples I'd meant to use for pie. I never made that pie. By 5 o'clock, I was calling every number in the school directory. His classmates, their parents. Some hadn't seen him since lunch, some swore they saw him near the front gate. A few mentioned he'd had his sketchbook out during recess sitting under that same row of trees he liked, but no one could say where he went after that. David came home from the shop around 6. I told him what was happening and we drove the usual routes Alder 32nd over to Belmont and back again. We checked the park, the old batting cages, even the lot behind the strip mall where Jacob used to sneak in and draw graffiti on the dumpsters. Nothing. No sign of him. That night I called the non-emergency line thinking maybe somehow this was a misunderstanding. Maybe he'd gone home with a friend and forgot to call. Maybe someone had seen something we missed. Officer Linda Hayes showed up just before 9. She was younger back then, maybe early 30s, with that crisp, clipped way of speaking that made you listen close. She took a statement, asked all the right questions, then gently pointed out that not every missing kid turns up right away. Sometimes they walk in the door before we even finish the paperwork, she said. I wanted to believe her. We sat up most of that night. Jacob's room was exactly how he'd left it, bed half-made sketchbook open on his desk, one sneaker tucked under the dresser. I kept going back in there like maybe I'd missed something, a note, a clue. But all I found was silence. The next morning, the rain came in steady. Officer Hayes returned with a second patrol officer and started canvassing the area. They spoke with neighbors, asked the school for security footage, pulled traffic cam logs. But nothing came back. He hadn't been seen walking toward the usual corners. No sightings in the grocery store lot. The cameras at the school had glitched out around 2:30 static on the tape, the detective said. The last visual of Jacob was blurry footage from inside the school hallway heading toward the exit. After that, he was gone. The week that followed moved in slow motion. Flyers went up. The local news ran a segment with his school photo, that same crooked grin and messy hair. David barely spoke. He threw himself into work at the garage, coming home after dark with grease still on his hands. I called the school every other day just to ask if anything had changed. It never had. At some point, Officer Hayes started coming by less often. Not because she didn't care. I think she did, but there just wasn't anything new to go on. The case grew quiet. Not closed, but still. That kind of stillness that settles into your bones. On the 1-month mark, I cleaned out the fridge and found the sandwich meat I'd bought for Jacob's lunches. It had expired. I stood there holding it hand frozen and then just dropped it in the trash like it burned. That was the first time I cried. The holidays passed. We kept his stocking on the mantel, his room untouched. I used to sit in his desk chair at night, flipping through his sketchbook page after page of strange landscapes, mountains with doors carved into them, long bridges leading nowhere, trees that looked like they were watching something off the edge of the page. I never understood those drawings, not really. But they were all I had. The years afterward blurred together in some ways. We did what people do, went back to work, paid the bills, answered fewer calls from reporters as time went on. People in the neighborhood stopped asking after a while. You could feel them shift when they saw us, like they weren't sure what to say anymore. David died 5 years ago. He'd had a stroke while working under a car. They said it was quick. I found the keychain a few days after the funeral tucked inside the top drawer of his workbench. The same one he'd given Jacob that morning. I hadn't realized he kept the spare. I carried it in my coat pocket for a long time after that. Some nights I'd catch myself holding it without realizing. Just the feel of it between my fingers was something solid, something that hadn't changed. Then came the knock. 14 years after Jacob disappeared. It was just past 11 on a rainy Thursday. I hadn't turned the porch light on yet, and the house was quiet TV on mute tea long gone cold. I froze in the kitchen, one hand on the counter. The knock came again. 3 soft raps. Not hurried, not unsure. I stood still for a long moment, heart in my throat, then walked to the front door and looked through the glass. There was a figure on the porch, tall, soaked, standing completely still. I opened the door part way, and that's when I saw it. His eyes. That keychain in his hand. And a voice I hadn't heard since he was a boy. He said 2 words. "It's me." But what came next wasn't a reunion. It was a warning. And it changed everything. I stood in the open doorway too long after he left, watching the rain flatten across the sidewalk where Jacob's boots had just been. I hadn't even asked where he was going. Just listened to him say tomorrow. Same time, but not here. He hadn't hugged me, hadn't even crossed the threshold. And the way he'd glanced back into the street, that flick of fear, that look I'd only seen once before in a patient who woke from a coma mid-nightmare, it stuck with me. The porch light caught the water sliding down the window glass, but all I saw was his face. Older, worn down, same eyes, same keychain, and then nothing but the hum of the television I'd left on mute, and the hollow sound of a house that hadn't heard his voice in 14 years. The next day at work felt like moving through a fog. I clocked in, answered questions, took vitals, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the porch. His voice rough and low. The way he'd stiffened when that car rolled by. Every time my phone buzzed, I hoped it was him. But it never was. Around mid-afternoon, I stepped out back behind the clinic for some air and ended up dialing the non-emergency line asking if Officer Linda Hayes still worked out of the precinct on Belmont. The woman on the other end said yes, then asked if I needed to file a report. I told her no. I wasn't sure what I was calling about. Just checking. That evening, I pulled the old box labeled Jacob down from the attic. Same one I hadn't touched since the year after he disappeared. Inside were the usual things: spelling tests, birthday cards, a soccer trophy shaped like a little golden foot. At the bottom was a folded piece of paper I didn't remember putting there. It was worn the kind of fold that had been creased and smoothed over again and again. I opened it slowly. It was a map. Just a handful of streets sketched in pencil, barely legible, with an X drawn near the river on the industrial side of town. I couldn't tell if Jacob had drawn it or if it had been slipped in sometime over the years. I held it under the kitchen light, trying to make sense of it when my phone buzzed again, this time a number I didn't recognize. I answered on the second ring. It was him. He asked if I was alone. I said yes. Then he told me to meet him that night late at a diner out on the edge of the city. Not near the house and not the neighborhood where he grew up. I asked him if everything was okay. He hesitated, then said, "Just come. But don't bring the map." When I asked how he knew about it, he paused again. "I didn't leave it there, Mom." Then he hung up. I left the house just after 10. It was still raining, but lighter now, more of a mist. The streets shimmered under the sodium lights, and the tires hissed when I turned onto the main road. About 2 blocks into the drive, I noticed the SUV behind me. Dark, newer model headlights fixed. At first, I told myself it was nothing. But each time I changed lanes, so did they. When I slowed down, they slowed. When I sped up, they kept pace. I don't know why I didn't turn around. Maybe I didn't want to spook Jacob. Maybe I needed to know if I was imagining things. I pulled into the lot behind the diner, parked under a flickering lamp, and stepped out slowly. The SUV rolled by without stopping, but I could feel its presence long after it disappeared from view. Inside the diner, everything was yellowed with time, old booths, scratched laminate, the kind of overhead lights that made everything feel just a little too exposed. Jacob was already there, back in the corner, hood up, hands around a coffee cup. He looked up when I walked in, nodded once, then motioned for me to sit. I slid into the booth across from him. Up close, the scar near his temple was more visible. His fingers tapped lightly against the table, uneven. His other hand stayed clenched around the keychain. I didn't know what to say. He broke the silence. "You came." I nodded. "You told me to." Then I added, "I wasn't followed." He looked past me toward the window. "You might have been." I didn't answer that. I reached into my coat and pulled out the map, slid it across the table. "Do you recognize this?" He stared at it for a long time before picking it up. When he unfolded it, his jaw tightened. "Where did you find this?" I told him. He shook his head. "I didn't draw it. I haven't seen it in years. Someone put it there on purpose." The bell over the door rang again. A tall man walked in, broad-shouldered, dark coat, baseball cap pulled low. He didn't glance at us, but as he passed, I saw his eyes flick toward our booth for just a split second. Jacob froze. The tapping stopped. He sat perfectly still. The man took a seat at the counter, ordered a coffee. I leaned in and whispered, "Do you know him?" Jacob didn't respond. He just stared straight ahead and said, barely above a breath, "We don't have much time. I need to tell you something. But don't react." My pulse kicked up. He kept his voice low. "The people who took me, they weren't after me. Not really. They wanted something from Dad. Something he wouldn't give up." I whispered back, "What kind of people? What did they want?" He glanced at the man at the counter, then looked back at me. "Documents. Or information. I still don't know exactly, but I know they never got it, and I know they think we still have it." I didn't know what to say. I slid the map back into my pocket and stood up like I was heading to the restroom. Jacob stood a second later, dropped a few bills on the table, and walked out the side door without looking back. We left separately. I drove straight home, locked the doors, drew the blinds. The SUV was back, this time parked across the street, engine idling. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I found a note slipped under the front door. No envelope, just a plain white sheet of printer paper with block letters. "Stop asking questions." No signature, no explanation. I looked up and down the street, but it was empty. No neighbors out, no car pulling away. I called the number Jacob had used. It went straight to voicemail. By noon, I made a decision. I took the map and drove out toward the river. The neighborhood on that side of the city had changed since Jacob disappeared. More warehouses, now chain-link fences, long stretches of empty sidewalk. I parked a few blocks out, walked the rest of the way. The air smelled like oil and wet concrete. When I reached the spot marked on the map, I found a rusted door hanging crooked on its hinges. It looked abandoned. I stepped inside. The warehouse was dark cold. Water dripped somewhere deep inside. I turned on my phone's flashlight and swept it across the space rows of crates, old pallets, broken equipment. Then something caught the light. A scrap of fabric on the floor. Blue. Thin from age, with an embroidered patch on one edge. I bent down. It was from Jacob's soccer team. The same uniform he'd worn the year he disappeared. Before I could process that, I heard footsteps. Not running, not cautious, just steady, measured, coming from deeper in the dark. I backed toward the door, phone shaking in my hand. The footsteps stopped. A voice, low flat, echoed from the shadows. "You shouldn't be here." I didn't wait. I turned and ran. That night, Jacob finally called again. I told him where I'd been. There was silence on the other end, then a sharp reply. "You shouldn't have gone. They're already watching me. Now they're watching you." I asked him who they were. He said, People who used to be close, closer than you think. Then he told me not to tell anyone, not even Linda Hayes. If anyone asks, he said, you haven't seen me. I agreed. Then I sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the wind rattle the windows and the sound of the fridge humming. And later, just after 3 a.m., I heard the soft, unmistakable sound of the doorknob turning downstairs. Once, then again, followed by a thin, moving beam of light tracing across the hallway wall. I reached into the drawer beside my bed and wrapped my hand around the hammer I'd kept there since David died. I didn't breathe. The light moved back down the stairs, then vanished. Minutes later, I saw a figure step into the same SUV across the street. The brake lights flared red as it rolled away into the fog. I stayed up till morning, and by sunrise I knew this wasn't just about Jacob anymore. They'd opened the door. Now I needed to know why. The day after I heard the doorknob turn, I didn't open the blinds. I made coffee, stood in the kitchen like I always did, but the routine felt hollow. Every sound in the house settling wood-groaning pipes made me freeze. Not because I thought someone was inside, but because I couldn't be sure they weren't. I'd lived in that house since before Jacob was born. I used to think I knew it like the back of my hand, but now it felt like a place where things hid in plain sight. Around 10, I called in to work and took the rest of the day off. I wasn't sick, but I couldn't bring myself to put on my scrubs smile at patients carry on like nothing was unraveling. I sat at the table with a pen and notepad and tried to write down everything I remembered, what Jacob had said, what I'd seen at the warehouse, the car, the man in the diner. It didn't come out clean. The notes were scattered. Half sentences, question marks, arrows pointing nowhere. I crossed most of it out. Around midday, I drove out to the precinct. I didn't call ahead. I just parked in the visitor lot and walked in. Officer Hayes was still there. Her hair was shorter than I remembered, and the lines around her eyes a little deeper. But the moment she saw me, her whole expression shifted. Not in that polite way strangers do, but in the way someone does when they've held on to a name too long, and suddenly it walks back through the door. She led me to her office and shut the door behind us. I didn't waste time. I told her everything. I told her Jacob had come back, that he was alive but cautious, that he'd said things weren't safe, not for either of us. I told her about the diner, the warehouse, the SUV. I even handed her the note that had been slipped under my door. The only thing I didn't tell her was where Jacob was now. That part I held back. Not because I didn't trust her. I just didn't know who else might be listening. She didn't interrupt much, just sat with her pen tapping softly against a closed folder. When I finally stopped talking, she leaned back in her chair and said, "If he's really back, then this isn't over." She stared at the note for a long moment. If they went to this much trouble to keep things buried, your family might have been tied to more than just a disappearance. I nodded. Then I said the part I hadn't said out loud yet. "I think it's someone we know." Her eyes narrowed slightly. Then she closed the folder, stood up, and said, "I want to see the warehouse myself. We didn't go that day, but we agreed to stay in touch." I gave her my cell, told her I'd try to keep Jacob talking. That evening I waited by the phone. No call. By 9 I was pacing. I didn't want to seem pushy, but I needed to know he was okay. I still didn't even know where he'd been all those years. Around 10:30 my phone rang. Unknown number again. This time he didn't ask if I was alone. He just said, "There's a park by the river. Pedestrian bridge. Tomorrow night. Meet me there." Not the diner. Not the house. Then he hung up. The next night I got there early. I parked a few blocks away and walked down the path under the streetlights. It was quiet. Cold. The river made that low, constant sound it always does in winter. I spotted him leaning on the bridge railing, hood pulled down low. When he turned toward me, I could see the circles under his eyes. I handed him the note, the one that had been left under my door. He unfolded it, read it once, then folded it back up. "This isn't a warning," he said. "It's a leash. They're letting us know they're still watching." I asked him again who they was. He hesitated. Then he said, "When I was taken, there was a man who showed up more than the others. He called himself Tom. He knew things about Dad. Stuff I didn't even know. Said Dad owed him. I thought it was money. But now I think it was something else. Something buried." He paused, then added papers. Records. Something your husband held on to that didn't belong to him. I didn't know what to say. David had always been quiet, kept to himself. But secrets like that don't sit still. They leak slowly like oil under a door. I told Jacob about the box I'd found in the attic and the folder inside. The map, the warehouse. That seemed to catch his attention. He asked if Dad had ever kept a workshop. I nodded. It was still out back, unchanged, since the day he died. The next morning we went out there together. I hadn't stepped inside in years. The air smelled like motor oil and old sawdust. Tools still hung on the pegboard, neat rows of wrenches and pliers. On the far shelf, jars of screws and bolts lined up like little glass soldiers. He walked slowly, taking it all in. Then he knelt by the back wall near the workbench and reached underneath. There was a metal toolbox tucked behind a stack of tarps. It wasn't one I recognized. The latch stuck a little, but when he pried it open, inside was a sealed manila envelope, brittle from time. He peeled it open carefully. Inside were property records, photocopies of deeds, and a faded black and white photo. 2 men standing in front of a building. One of them was David. The other I'd never seen before. But Jacob pointed at him. "That's Tom," he said. "That's the man who watched me grow up under a different name." I stared at the picture. The grain of it, the angle of my husband's jaw, the building behind them. The warehouse. My voice shook when I asked him why he hadn't told me sooner. He looked down, then said, "Because I didn't know if you'd believe me. And because there's more." Tom wasn't working alone. Someone else helped him. Someone close. Before I could ask, a shadow moved past the workshop window. Just a flicker, not enough to see a face. Jacob stepped toward the door, opened it fast, but the yard was empty. Just the wind in the trees. On the porch under a stone was another note. Handwritten this time. 2 words. Last warning. That night I dreamed about the maple tree. Only it was winter again, and the branches were bare. From every limb hung a scrap of fabric blue like the one I'd found in the warehouse. And below it, Jacob stood 13 again, holding out the keychain, mouthing something I couldn't hear. I woke just after dawn. My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. 1 line, midnight, warehouse. Come alone if you want answers. I sat there in bed staring at the screen. Then I got up, opened the drawer where I kept David's old folding knife, and placed it beside my keys. Whatever this was, whatever had started all those years ago, it wasn't finished yet. And I didn't intend to wait behind a locked door for it to come knocking again. I parked 3 blocks from the warehouse engine off headlights dimmed. The rain had started again, just enough to muffle sound and blur the edges of things. In the passenger seat, I had the flashlight, the folded map, and the same kitchen knife David used to open boxes out in the shop. I didn't expect to use it, but I brought it anyway. The stretch of road between the car and the warehouse was quiet. No traffic, no people, just the sound of the river nearby, slow and steady behind the buildings. I kept my hood up and walked quickly, counting my steps. The rusted metal door looked the same as before, hanging crooked on the hinges. I pushed it open and slipped inside. It was darker than I remembered. No working lights, no movement, just moonlight filtering through a broken window high up on the wall. My boots echoed faintly as I stepped forward, sweeping the flashlight across the floor. Most of the crates and pallets were still there, half collapsed and water damaged. I paused near the far wall where I'd found the blue fabric last time. The beam of my light caught it again, same size, same shape, still there on the floor like it had been waiting. I picked it up, turned it over. The embroidered patch was fraying at the edge, but still clear enough. Jacob's team the year before, he vanished. That year came back sharp. The cleats, the drive to away games, the way David always made sure to tighten the laces just once more before Jacob ran out onto the field. I stood there a minute too long. That's when I heard the footsteps. Not behind me, off to the side. Steady, slow, like someone wasn't trying to sneak up, but didn't need to rush either. I turned off the flashlight and stepped back, pressing myself into the shadow between two columns. The footsteps stopped. Then a voice, low and calm, echoed out across the space. "You shouldn't be here." I didn't wait for more. I turned and moved as fast as I could back to the entrance, hand gripping the handle of the knife in my coat pocket. Outside, the wind hit hard against my face. I didn't stop until I was back in the car, doors locked, hands shaking. The warehouse stayed dark behind me. No one followed. Later that night, Jacob called. His voice was tight. "Where were you today?" I told him. I didn't lie. He went quiet for a long beat, then said, "You shouldn't have gone. They're already watching me. Now they'll be watching you too." I asked him who they were, again asked him what they wanted so badly that they were willing to tear apart what was left of our family. His answer was quiet. People who used to be close. Closer than you think. Before I could push further, he cut me off. "I'll explain tomorrow. But if anyone asks, you haven't seen me. You understand?" I told him I did. Then I stayed awake until dawn. That morning was clear finally. No rain. Just that stillness Portland sometimes gets right after a storm. I made coffee, checked the locks, walked the house twice. Nothing was out of place. But I couldn't shake the sense that something had already been moved, already looked through. By late afternoon, I decided to call Linda Hayes. I didn't tell her about the midnight message or the fabric. I just told her I had a feeling things were starting to shift. She told me she was working a case but could meet in 2 days. I said, all right. Then I started going through David's files again. That night, just after 2 a.m., I heard it. A creak on the stairs. Not the old house, shifting kind. This was slower, measured. I sat up in bed, listened hard. The floorboard outside the bedroom door didn't make a sound. But the air felt different too still. I eased the drawer open and wrapped my hand around the hammer again. Same as last time. Then the sound came again. This time from downstairs. Not heavy, but real. I waited. Then I heard the soft, almost metallic click of the front door closing. I didn't move. I didn't turn on a light. I stayed still and counted until the silence stopped buzzing in my ears. In the morning, there was nothing missing, but the doormat was damp. The next day, Jacob called early, told me to meet him near the old pedestrian bridge by the river, same place as before. I packed the fabric scrap in a plastic sandwich bag just in case and left the house a little after 5. When I got there, he was already waiting, hands in his jacket pockets, staring down at the water. I gave him the bag. He didn't take it right away, just looked at it. Then he said, "They left it there on purpose, to see if you'd come back." I asked him if he meant they were testing me. He nodded. Then he said, "They know I'm talking to you. They're giving you time to stop." I told him about the footsteps, the door closing, the notes. I told him it wasn't just warnings anymore, that someone was getting close. He looked out over the water for a while. Then he said something that stayed with me longer than anything else that week. It wasn't just that I disappeared, Mom. They needed me gone. Because they thought Dad had something he wasn't supposed to keep. And they figured if they took me, he'd give it up. I felt the words before I understood them. I asked him, "Did he?" Jacob shook his head. "I don't think so. And now they think you have it." I didn't respond right away. I asked what it was. He didn't know for sure, just that it had to do with the building, with records or files or something buried. Something Tom wanted and maybe others too. That name again. Tom. I asked if he thought Tom was behind all of this. Jacob nodded. Him and someone else. Someone who stayed close after Dad died. He wouldn't say who, just that it wasn't random. That night I didn't sleep much again. Around sunrise I made a list. Not of strangers, but of people who'd stayed around. People who knew our schedule, knew where we kept things, who had keys or access or reasons to stop asking questions. It was a short list, but it wasn't empty. At the top was a name I hadn't spoken aloud in years. I folded the list and put it in my purse. Later that morning, a new note appeared. No envelope, just tucked into the edge of the screen door. Block letters again. This time it didn't say, "Stop asking." It just said tomorrow. And below that, a time. Midnight. Same warehouse. No mention of Jacob. No signature. I stood there holding it for a long time, then placed it on the kitchen table next to the knife and the plastic bag with the blue fabric. I didn't know what they wanted me to find, but I knew I had to be ready for it, because whatever it was tied to something David had touched and hidden. And whatever was buried in that building, whatever was waiting under all that dust and steel, it had kept someone willing to steal a child, follow a widow, and leave a trail of quiet warnings across 14 years. The warehouse looked different at night. The kind of dark that didn't feel natural, like it had settled in layers instead of shadows. I left my car 3 blocks out again, parked under a dead streetlight near a chain-link fence, and walked the rest. There was no wind, just the sound of the river behind me and the dull scrape of gravel under my shoes. I had the flashlight in one pocket, David's folding knife in the other. The scrap of fabric stayed tucked inside my coat, though I didn't plan on showing it to anyone this time. I approached from the west off the alley that ran between the old machine shop and the rail spur. That way I could see the side entrance first. The rusted one I'd used before, but something told me not to go in that way again. So I circled around to the front. The front door was shut, locked at least from the outside. But as I stood there listening, I heard it. Footsteps inside. Not pacing, just shifting, waiting. I knocked once light but firm. No answer. Then a voice, low and flat, said, "Come in." The door creaked when I pushed it open, hinges groaning like they hadn't moved in years. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been. Damp. Dust rose in thin curls with every step. The moonlight filtered down in long slats through broken panes high above, and between those slats stood Jacob. His hood was down. His hands were at his sides, and his voice was quiet. "You shouldn't have come." I stopped about 10 feet from him. "You told me to?" I said. "I didn't send that message," he replied. Before I could say anything else, a second voice spoke, this one from behind a stack of crates. She figured it out faster than I expected. A man stepped out, taller than Jacob, broader, maybe mid-60s. Gray in his beard coat zipped to the collar. I knew his face the second I saw it. Not from memory, but from the photo in David's box. "Tom." His voice was steady, almost rehearsed. "I'm not here to hurt you, Margaret," he said. "But there's something you need to understand." I didn't respond. I glanced at Jacob, who didn't move. Tom took a step closer, his boots echoing against the concrete. "Your husband and I built something. It wasn't illegal, not at first. It was just private. But then he decided to keep it for himself. And I needed leverage." He looked toward Jacob. "That leverage was your son." Jacob didn't flinch. "It kept him quiet for years," Tom went on. But then he died. And now we're left with the question, did he give what he took to you? My mouth felt dry. I don't know what you're talking about, I said. Tom shook his head like he didn't quite believe me. The documents, the access codes, the warehouse deed. This place isn't just sitting on concrete. There's something under it. And your husband knew. I looked at Jacob. He reached into his jacket and pulled something from his pocket, small metal glinting in the low light. His keychain. It's not just a keychain, he said. It's an actual key. Tom's eyes narrowed. To what? There's a hatch, Jacob answered. Back wall, under the old fuse box. It opens a floor panel. Tom motioned for us to move. We walked together, him behind Jacob leading me in between. I kept one hand on the flashlight but didn't turn it on. Jacob knelt by the far wall, brushed aside a pile of debris, and pried up a loose plank. Beneath it was a small steel hatch. The key slid in, turned with a click. Underneath was a lockbox. Heavy, dull silver. He lifted it out and set it down on an overturned crate. Tom stepped forward, but Jacob raised a hand. Not yet. Tell her everything. Tom looked between us, then let out a slow breath. This place, this warehouse, sits on an old tunnel. Back in the 80s, it was used to move things. Cash, equipment, things nobody wanted traced. Your father, he nodded at Jacob, was part of it. So was I. But one day he found something in that tunnel that didn't belong to either of us. And instead of turning it over, he hid it. I stared at the lockbox. What was it? Tom looked at me. A ledger. Names, dates, payouts. The kind of thing that ruins people. We think your husband was waiting for the right moment to use it. But the moment never came. Before anyone could speak again, headlights swept across the broken windows. Not slow, not passing. They hit hard, sharp, and then cut off. An engine stopped. Doors slammed. Jacob's eyes went wide. They're here. 3 men entered through the side. Dark jackets. One carried a crowbar. Another held a pistol. The one in front looked toward Tom and said, You were supposed to bring the boy, not the mother. Tom stepped in front of me. Plans changed, he said. The man smirked. Then they change again. He raised the pistol. Jacob moved first. He swung the lockbox hard into the man's arm. The shot went wide. Metal rang off the wall. I dropped to the floor. Tom lunged, grabbed the pistol as it fell, shoved the man backward. Go! He shouted. Jacob grabbed my hand and we ran. Between crates down the middle aisle toward the front. Our steps echoed loud, our breath louder. Outside, the cold slapped my face. We didn't stop until we reached the car. Jacob threw the box in the back seat. I fumbled the keys. The tires spun as we pulled away. In the mirror, I saw shadows spill out of the building. But no one followed. Not yet. We drove in silence for a while. Then I asked, What's in it? Really? Jacob looked at me. The truth. About what happened to me. And maybe about who Dad really was. I didn't ask more. Not then. Behind us, the street curved and disappeared. Ahead, the road opened wide and empty. For now. But we both knew it wouldn't stay that way. We didn't drive straight home. Jacob sat stiff beside me, both hands braced on his knees, the lockbox wedged between his feet like something alive. Neither of us spoke until we hit Stark Street and the SUV from earlier pulled into view in the rearview mirror. No headlights, just the dark shape behind us shadowing every turn. I tightened my grip on the wheel, and Jacob finally said, We can't go back to the house. I nodded once, already rerouting in my head. Where do we take it? He looked at me, voice flat. There's only one person I trust to handle what's inside. We didn't have to say her name. 10 minutes later, I turned onto the back lot behind the Belmont precinct. Detective Hayes met us at the rear door. Her face shifted the moment she saw the box, less surprise, more resolve. She opened the side door without a word and waved us in. We followed her down a back hallway into a small interview room with no windows and a single overhead light that buzzed faintly. Jacob set the box on the table and stepped back. Linda eyed it like it might be wired. "What am I looking at?" she asked. Jacob met her eyes. Proof. Of everything. My abduction. What my father was involved in. And who's still protecting it. Linda didn't respond right away. She left the room and came back a minute later with a crowbar. The lid of the box groaned open, then fell back with a hollow clank. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and thick with age, was a leather-bound ledger. The spine cracked as Jacob opened it. Inside were pages of slanted handwriting columns of names, dates, transaction amounts. Many were unfamiliar. Some weren't. My eyes stopped on one line about a third of the way down, Hayes L., $15,000. I didn't say anything at first. Then I looked at her. She didn't flinch, just stared down at the page. "It's not what it looks like," she said quietly. Jacob's jaw tightened. "So that's why you kept digging." Linda's voice stayed even. It wasn't to protect them. It was to keep this from falling into worse hands. Jacob didn't answer. Neither did I. The lights flickered once, then again, then went out entirely. A beat of silence passed. Then the sound of boots multiple sets moved down the hallway outside. Linda pulled her service weapon and motioned for us to move. "Back exit. Go now." Jacob hesitated, but she didn't. "If they get me, they won't get the ledger. I've been ready for that for a long time." We didn't argue. We slipped out through the emergency door, out into the alley, the night wet again from fresh rain. The air smelled of wet asphalt and metal. We moved fast, cutting behind dumpsters and fences, keeping low. Jacob held the ledger tight under his jacket. A block and a half from the precinct, we spotted my car. But someone else was already waiting. Tom stepped out from the shadows beside a recycling bin. No gun, no weapon, just his hands raised in a calm, quiet surrender. "They'll kill you for that ledger," he said. "Give it to me and I can make sure you disappear for good this time. Somewhere they'll never find you." Jacob stared at him. "You mean the way you disappeared me before Tom didn't blink? I kept you alive." His voice was even, as if that should have been enough. I took one step between them, by stealing 14 years of his life. Tom didn't answer. Sirens wailed in the distance, faint but getting closer. He looked over his shoulder, then back to Jacob. "Choose. Now." Jacob pulled the wrapped ledger from under his jacket, or what looked like it. He stepped forward and handed it over, jacket still folded tight around it. Tom took it without checking, turned, and vanished into the dark. I stared at Jacob, stunned. "You gave it to him?" He unzipped his coat slowly and pulled out the real ledger. "No," he said. "I gave him my sketchbook." We didn't wait. The cruiser lights were coming around the corner. We got into the car, pulled out fast. I didn't exhale until the SUV was just a dot behind us and the flashing lights flooded the street. We drove the long way home. No words, just the thrum of tires and the steady whisper of windshield wipers pushing aside another night's worth of rain. When we reached the house, Jacob didn't go inside right away. He stood on the porch, the keychain in his hand. The house looked like it always had. The maple tree was bare now, branches stripped clean. I watched him stand there and realized the danger hadn't passed, but for the first time it felt like we had something they wanted, more than we feared losing it. I asked, "What happens now?" He didn't look at me, just stared at the dark street ahead. "We finish what Dad started," he said, "and we make sure no one else disappears the way I did." The next morning, Linda was gone. I called the precinct. They said she'd taken a leave. No other explanation. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. A few days later, Jacob told me the ledger was safe. He'd passed it on to a federal contact Linda had once mentioned by name. After that, everything moved fast. Quietly, but fast. People started getting arrested, names we recognized from the city council. Old business owners, one former cop. We watched it unfold from the living room, volume low, Jacob always sitting forward, hands pressed tight together. It didn't feel like justice. Not yet. But it felt like something had finally broken open. And this time it wasn't just our family. This time it was theirs. It took a few more days before I let Jacob go anywhere alone. Even with arrests starting to surface, names from the ledger landing in headlines, some quietly booked, others publicly disgraced, I still double-checked the locks at night and parked the car facing the street. Jacob didn't push back. He moved through the house with that same careful quiet he'd had when he first came home. But something had shifted. His sketchbook sat open on the kitchen table now. The drawings weren't like the ones he used to make as a kid, no comic characters or imaginary scenes. These were detailed floor plans, faces from memory maps that meant something only to him. Every page had a number in the corner. At first I thought they were just his way of coping. Then one night I noticed something odd. The sketch marked 27 showed a long corridor like the one under the old warehouse, but in the upper right corner, in faint pencil, he'd written the word duplicate. I asked him about it. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, there was another place. Not in Portland, somewhere farther out. I think I remember a road sign. A name with Pine in it. I waited. Like Pine Hollow. Or Pine Vale. Something like that. He flipped to a blank page and started sketching again. The next day, I put in a request with a contact I had over at the DMV, someone I'd leaned on once or twice before for off-the-record help. I asked for anything tied to property records, transport logs, or contractor permits that included the phrase Pine near known network locations. I didn't expect much, but the name that came back stopped me cold. Pine Haven. A decommissioned juvenile center about 80 miles east, up past the river bend, sold off 5 years ago and officially abandoned since. But here's the thing, there were still utility draws on the grid. Not regular ones, but enough to flag movement. Water once in a while, electricity sometimes. I didn't tell Jacob right away. I drove out there first. The road to Pine Haven curved through forested hills that looked like they hadn't changed in 50 years. No traffic, no nearby homes, just a crumbling 2-lane path that ended at a rusted gate. I got out and walked. The fence had a new lock. There were camera mounts near the corners, old but recent wiring. I backed out before I got close. On the drive home, I kept thinking about the date on the property deed. February 18th, 2007. That was 4 weeks after Jacob disappeared. I parked a few blocks from the house, circled once on foot to make sure we weren't followed, then stepped inside and set the printout on the kitchen table. He looked at it without blinking. That's the place, he said. That's where they took us after the basement. It was colder, bigger. I think there were others. We stayed up late, mapping out everything he could recall. The sound of distant train horns, the texture of a cinder block wall that always leaked, a radio playing classical music at odd hours. By midnight, we had a list of details and a sketch that matched the overhead blueprints I'd pulled from the county archive. I could see it on his face, something inside him clicking into place like a safe slowly unlocking. The next morning, I got a call from Linda Hayes. No official number, no caller ID, just her voice, quiet and measured. They're going to burn Pine Haven. If you're going, go now. Then the line cut. We didn't wait. I grabbed a thermal drone from a friend at the newspaper, claimed I was working a story on forest misuse. Jacob packed a camera, his sketchbook, and a flashlight. We drove fast, no music, no talk. Just the sound of the tires and the wind. When we reached the gate again, the lock was gone. The fence had been clipped. Inside, Pine Haven looked half devoured by moss and time. One of the side buildings had collapsed in on itself. The main structure still stood, though windows, dark and broken, the front doors slightly ajar. Jacob led the way. We moved slow, one room at a time. The place reeked of mildew and rust. Faint outlines of old lockers peeling paint, a cracked tile floor that seemed to slope downward. Then he stopped. A hallway to the left, narrower, newer concrete. He didn't speak, just walked slower now. At the end of the corridor, he reached for the wall and pressed a hand to the cinder block. "There was a door here," he whispered. "They covered it." I ran my light along the seam, barely visible but there, bricks filled in sloppily. Jacob stepped back, then turned and pointed up an air vent loose at the corner. He handed me the flashlight and hoisted himself up. For a second, I saw the same kid who used to climb the garage rafters without fear. He disappeared inside, then called down. "It's hollow behind the wall, still open." I passed the camera up to him. He moved slowly, narrating each turn. Then his voice caught. "There are beds in here, fold-out cots, and photos, old ones, of kids, taped to the wall." I heard him step down again, the duct creaking as he crawled back toward the opening. When he dropped to the ground, his face was pale. "They never shut it down," he said. "They just moved out and waited. We didn't stay." I grabbed a broken nameplate from the floor, Pine Haven Intake Room 2, and we left the same way we came. As we reached the tree line, I turned back and saw smoke rising from the rear of the building. Not flames yet, but enough to tell me we weren't the only ones there. By the time we reached the car, we heard sirens again. Not police, not fire, something else. A low, droning hum like a warning buried in the woods. We drove back to Portland without speaking. Jacob held the camera on his lap, the photos already backed up to a secure cloud. When we got home, he slid the nameplate onto the table and looked at me. "There were 28 beds," he said, "but only 25 faces on the wall." He didn't have to say the rest. Some of them didn't make it out. And whoever was still protecting what happened there, they weren't finished yet. The camera footage we turned in was time-stamped, geotagged, and backed up in 3 separate places. I made sure of that before I handed anything over. By the time the Pine Haven site went up in flames, a federal task force had already opened a file. The fire was ruled undetermined, of course. It was, but not before someone leaked a few frames of what Jacob had captured. 28 beds, wall photos, a sketchbook with room layouts that matched archived floor plans. It wasn't enough to undo what had been hidden all those years, but it cracked the door open. Arrests came slow, not in the way most people imagine, no headlines, no handcuffs on the news. Some were buried in sealed indictments, others just quietly resigned. A few disappeared altogether. The only thing public was a report released months later, redacted so heavily it read more like a list of what they couldn't say. But that was fine by me. It was never about spectacle. It was about truth finding its way through. Jacob kept drawing. Not out of fear, more like memory management. He told me once that sketching was the only way he could tell what was real and what was planted. He doesn't go out much, doesn't like crowds, but he's not hiding either. We talk more now than we ever did when he was younger. Sometimes we sit in silence. Other times he asks questions I don't always know how to answer, like why no one ever came looking for him sooner, or why someone like our dad might have known something and chose not to act. I don't lie to him. I just tell him I'm still learning too. Linda Hayes was never officially connected to the case. She vanished not long after we turned everything over, but before she did, she sent one last envelope, no return address. Inside was a single cassette tape, no label. Just Jacob's voice on one side recorded years earlier. A monitored session, probably from Pine Haven. He was maybe 12. Talking about a dog he didn't have. A backyard that didn't exist. It wasn't his memory, it was one they gave him. At the end of the tape he says, "I'm ready to forget now. Please." That line still breaks something in me, but I keep the tape. Not because I want to hear it again, just to remind myself how far he's come since that day. Some names from that wall were traced, others weren't. A few families got quiet phone calls, quiet visits, quiet updates. Some didn't want to know. Others did. I get that. We all grieve differently, but I remember every one of those numbers Jacob marked in his sketchbook. Every blank space where a name should have been. And I think if someone's going to remember them, it might as well be me. I don't have some neat closing to offer. I wish I did. What happened to Jacob and to those other kids doesn't fit in a single ending. But I can say this memory is its own kind of justice. And sometimes the act of remembering, of refusing to let the silence win, is what makes the difference between being lost forever and being found by someone who still cares. If this story meant something to you, I hope you'll hold space for it. Maybe share it. Not for clicks or outrage, but because someone's name might still be out there waiting to be spoken, and no one deserves to be forgotten.